Usually, when we talk about a structural collapse, like a suspension bridge failing or, I don't know, a skyscraper coming down, there's this expectation of obvious visible warning signs.
Right, yeah. You expect to see the damage.
Exactly. You look at a load-bearing concrete pillar, and you see a massive, jagged shear crack running right down the center.
Yeah.
And the structural inspector just points at it and says, there's your problem.
It's a very binary threat.
Right. It's broken or it's not brick, and you can literally photograph it.
Well, the visual nature of that kind of decay it's comforting, honestly. Humans are highly visually oriented creatures.
Well, for sure.
If we can see the crack in the foundation, we feel this the sense of agency, we can patch it, or we can just evacuate the building. The sensory data perfectly aligns with the required action.
But when you step into the macro history of civilizational collapse, how entire societies, empires, and global systems just fall apart, that visual inspection completely fails us.
It absolutely does.
Right.
It's useless.
You can have a society with gleaming skylines, right? A booming stock market, cutting-edge technology, and absolutely zero visible cracks on the surface.
Right. To the naked eye, it looks completely invincible.
Exactly. Yet underneath it all, the foundation is already pulverized.
Yeah, the diagnostic waters become incredibly muddy here because the decay of a civilization, it isn't in the bricks and mortar, it's entirely embedded in the socio-economic programming.
The invisible stuff.
Exactly. The algorithms that govern resource distribution, justice, power, those are what rot first. And, well, you cannot photograph a rotting algorithm.
Which is such a perfect transition to the text we are diving into today. Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive. We are looking at what I would call an ancient diagnostic manual.
It really is a masterclass on civilizational survival.
Yeah. Specifically, we're looking at Surah Al-Hajj, verses 42 to 51, and we're guided by a highly rigorous lecture from G.A. Parwez. This is Lecture 6 from the Tollouese long digital audio series.
And we really need to set some ground rules for you, the listener, before we even start.
Yes, please. The mission statement.
Right. We are stripping away the traditional, orthodox way this text is usually read. No religious sentimentality, no chanting, no mystical, airy-fairy interpretations.
None of that.
Yeah.
We are reading this purely as master sociologists and systems engineers.
Because the source material practically demands this framework. I mean, it is actively hostile to blind faith and unthinking ritual.
It really is. It basically posits that understanding human history requires a strict empirical methodology.
Yes. So let's start right at the core paradox of societal collapse. To understand how societies fall, we first have to figure out why the people living inside them almost universally fail to see it coming.
Right. Like, if you ever wondered why the Romans didn't see the end of Rome until the gates were literally breached.
It's a classic historical blind spot.
Yeah. And verse 22.46 diagnoses this condition directly. It states, and I quote, "It is not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts within the breasts."
Okay, we have to stop immediately right here and rescue the word heart from centuries of poetic hijacking.
The Valentine's Day definition, right?
Exactly. When modern readers hear the word heart, they instantly imagine sentimentality. They think of emotion, intuition, empathy, romance.
All the squishy stuff.
Right, the purely emotional center. But in the linguistic framework of this text, and as Parwez meticulously details in his lecture, the heart, the qualb, is the engine of human reason.
Wait, reason, not emotion?
Yes. The root of the word qualb implies turning, processing, churning. It's the intellect. It is the data processor.
Oh, wow. So the diagnosis here is terrifyingly clinical, actually.
Extremely calm.
It's saying that your sensory organs are working perfectly. Your eyes see the poverty on the streets. Your ears hear the unrest. You have perfect 20/20 vision of the raw data.
But the processor is broken.
Right. The failure to anticipate the collapse isn't a sensory defect. It's a profound intellectual paralysis.
The society is experiencing this systemic refusal to process data and reason logically from cause to effect.
I'm picturing an airplane cockpit. Like, the altitude is dropping rapidly, the terrain warning is blaring loudly, the dashboard is flashing bright red.
A total sensory overload of warnings.
Exactly. Having 20/20 vision doesn't save the aircraft. If the pilot just refuses to compute that red flashing light, means we are going to crash into that mountain.
Right. The sensory data is received, but the intellectual processing center, the qualb, completely shuts down.
Why does it shut down? I mean, survival instinct should kick in, right?
Well, the reason it shuts down is cognitive dissonance on a massive civilizational scale.
I see.
Think about it. Acknowledging that the red flashing light means a crash would require the pilot to drastically change course. In a society, acknowledging the data of collapse requires dismantling the very socio-economic systems that currently provide the elites with all their wealth and comfort.
So it's basically easier to disable the alarm than to rebuild the engine.
Exactly. But the text doesn't just offer this diagnosis, it offers a direct physical prescription.
Right, that same verse commands the reader to travel the land so their hearts may reason. The Arabic phrase is yakiluna biha.
Yes. Get out into the physical world and process the data.
And notice the methodology being commanded here. It does not prescribe sitting in an isolated room, meditating until some sort of spiritual enlightenment just descends from the sky.
No, it demands actual field work.
Which brings me to a piece of the lecture that I really wrestled with. Parwez brings in this incredibly sharp critique of how we interact with history.
The picnicker's critique.
Yes, he mocks people who treat historical ruins like tourist destinations. He literally calls them picnickers. They go to ancient, collapsed cities, take photos of the architecture, enjoy the scenery, and just leave.
Yep.
But wait, I mean, tourists actually fund archaeological preservation, right?
Yeah.
Is the text really suggesting that visiting the Colosseum or Machu Picchu is inherently a blind act?
Well, the critique isn't against the act of traveling itself. It's against the cognitive passivity of the traveler.
Okay, unpack that for me.
If you walk through the ruins of a collapsed empire and your only takeaway is, wow, look at the size of these stones, or what a beautiful sunset over the columns, you have entirely missed the data.
Oh, I see. You're treating it as aesthetics.
Exactly. You are looking at a crime scene and evaluating the aesthetic quality of the blood spatter.
Wow. That's a grim metaphor, but it works.
The text demands that you look at the ruins and ask what socio-economic laws caused this massive, complex structure to turn to dust. If you aren't doing forensic sociology, your travel is just entertainment. Your eyes are open, but your intellect is asleep.
He also extends this critique to asceticism, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely.
Like the spiritual leaders who isolate themselves in monasteries or cloisters, just counting beads, completely refusing to interact with the messy physical reality of economics and politics.
Because true enlightenment, according to this specific framework, is equated with the active, rational, empirical observation of the physical world. If your version of spirituality requires you to ignore the mechanics of human suffering and societal organization, it's not enlightenment. It is an abdication of your responsibility as a reasoning being.
So if we are supposed to be conducting a systems audit of the Earth, what exactly are we looking for in the wreckage?
We need to look at verse 22.45 for that.
Right. The imagery there is incredibly vivid. It describes a township fallen on its roofs, it's well abandoned, its lofty palace empty.
And we must maintain our discipline here. We have to read this forensically, not poetically.
So no sad metaphors about the passage of time.
No. These are the physical data sets of social collapse left standing for us. Let's isolate the two specific variables presented in that verse, the abandoned well and the empty lofty palace.
Okay, so a well, especially in the context of an early urban or agrarian society, is the primary means of production. It's the economic engine.
Exactly.
If the well is abandoned, the engine has seized, sustenance has halted, society dies.
And right next to this dead economic engine stands the lofty palace.
The physical manifestation of hoarded, concentrated wealth.
Right. It represents a system where resources, power, and capital were aggressively funneled upward into the hands of an elite class. And they used it to build massive structures of luxury.
The text is intentionally putting them side by side to imply causality, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the palace didn't just happen to outlast the well by coincidence.
Not at all.
The building of the lofty palace is what caused the well to be abandoned in the first place.
That is the core mechanical argument of the passage. Wealth hoarding is not a victimless act in a closed economic system.
Right.
When an elite class concentrates capital to build their lofty palaces, they are actively pulling resources away from the maintenance of the public infrastructure, the well. They literally starve the productive base.
I want to break down exactly how that works mechanically, though.
Yeah.
Like, how does a palace kill a well?
Through the misallocation of capital and the destruction of the velocity of money.
Okay, sociology meets economics.
Exactly. When wealth is distributed equitably, it moves. People buy goods, they invest in tools, they maintain their infrastructure, and they trade. The economy remains fluid.
The water is flowing, so to speak.
Yes. But when an elite class hoards the capital, it stagnates. It gets locked up in vanity projects, the lofty palaces. The working class, who are deprived of their fair share of the value they produce, can no longer afford to maintain the very engines of production.
Wow, so the well runs dry, not because there's no water left in an aquifer, but because the society can literally no longer afford the rope and the bucket.
Precisely. And to prove that this isn't just an isolated tragedy, the text introduces a controlled sociological experiment.
Ah, yes. Verses 22.42 to 44, it rolls out this list of past civilizations, the people of Noah, Ad, Jamud, the people of Abraham, Lot, and Midian.
Think about the parameters of this data set for a second. We are looking at cultures separated by vast geographies
Totally different time periods.
and wildly varying levels of technological advancement.
Let's actually unpack this data set because the source material implies a very specific economic profile for each of these civilizations.
It does.
Take the people of Noah. We usually just think of a giant flood and some animals on a boat.
Yeah.
But what was the systemic issue there?
The historical and sociological framing of Noah's people points to a deeply entrenched agrarian monopoly.
Okay, so land control.
Right. You had an elite class that controlled all the arable land, creating a rigid caste system where the laborers were entirely disenfranchised from the fruits of their own harvest. The system was rigged at the level of basic food production.
And then you move forward in time to Ad. Now, this wasn't just a farming community. This was an imperial power.
Yes, Ad is synonymous with monumental architecture and the military-industrial complex of the ancient world.
The lofty pillars.
Exactly. They built massive pillars, projecting physical and military dominance over surrounding regions. Their economy was based on imperialism.
Meaning extraction.
Right, extracting resources from conquered peoples to fund the vanity projects of their ruling class back in the capital. They completely exhausted their environment and their vassal states just to maintain their lofty palaces.
What about Thamud? They were the ones carving whole cities out of mountains.
Thamud represents a monopoly over natural resources, the narrative of the she-camel in their history.
Right, which always seemed so random to me.
Well, it's essentially a socio-economic metaphor for public goods.
Really?
Yes. The elite of Thamud tried to privatize the communal water sources, restricting access to the lifeblood of the valley. It was a crisis of privatization and resource hoarding. The camel represented the equitable share of water.
Oh, that makes so much more sense. Okay, then you have the people of Abraham facing off against Nimrod,
That is the classic temple economy.
meaning religion and state were merged.
Merged and weaponized. Nimrod's Babylon wasn't just a political dictatorship. It was a state-controlled economy where the banking system, the grain silos, and the government were all unified under a religious priesthood.
So a total monopoly.
You couldn't participate in the economy at all without submitting to the ideological and financial control of the state temple.
And then there's the people of Lot. Usually that story is read purely through the lens of personal morality. You know, bedroom politics.
But the Quranic text explicitly links their destruction to highway robbery and the cutting off of trade routes.
Wait, highway robbery.
Yes. They sat on a major geographic choke point and built an economy on predatory taxation, xenophobia, and the intersectional exploitation of travelers and vulnerable outsiders. It was a purely parasitic economy.
Which brings us to Midian, the last one on the list.
Midian is perhaps the most modern sounding of them all. Their defining characteristic was institutionalized financial fraud.
White-collar crime in the ancient world.
Exactly. They manipulated weights and measures, and this wasn't just, a merchant putting his thumb on the scale in a local market.
Right.
It was systemic market manipulation. It was the ancient equivalent of rigging interest rates or high-frequency trading fraud. They built an entire society on predatory financial extraction.
So if we pull all this together across all these completely different economic models, agrarian monopolies, military imperialism, resource privatization, state temple economies, parasitic toll gating, and financial fraud, there is the exact same independent variable.
Yes, and the text identifies that variable as zulm.
Zulm, another word we definitely need to redefine for the audience.
Yeah, zulm is often very weakly translated as just wrongdoing or sin. But if you look at its linguistic root, it means to put something where it does not belong.
Misplacement.
Right. In a systemic context, zulm is entrenched socio-economic injustice. It is the misallocation of wealth and power. It's the hoarding of resources away from the people whose labor actually produces them.
So the equation being tested in this huge historical laboratory is actually very simple. Systemic exploitation zulm across any geography, any time period, and any technological level always equals civilizational seizure.
Always.
It always results in the abandoned well and the empty palace. It's basically as predictable as gravity.
But this raises a fascinating paradox within the data itself.
What's that?
Well, in every single one of these historical case studies, before the collapse actually occurs, a messenger or a warner appears.
Right.
And in every single case, the society violently rejects them. Why? I mean, if someone shows up and points out the fatal flaw in your suspension bridge, you don't assassinate them, you hire them to fix it.
You do if fixing the bridge threatens your multi-billion-dollar monopoly on the toll booth.
Exactly.
If the messenger's telling the elite of Midian to stop manipulating the markets, he isn't just giving them a polite moral lecture. He is actively threatening their entire economic foundation.
And the source lecture emphasizes this profoundly. These messengers, they were not bringing mere rituals.
They weren't just saying pray this way.
No, they weren't asking the elites to adopt a new personal philosophy. They were bringing a revolutionary socio-economic system designed to dismantle the lofty palaces and return the water of the well to the public.
And the elite reaction is just pure political calculation, isn't it? The text notes that these messengers lived among their people for decades, 40 years in some cases, before speaking out.
They had pristine records of character.
Yeah, they were known as the most honest, trustworthy individuals in the society. But the very second they challenged the economic status quo,
They are instantly branded as liars.
the sudden shift from most trusted citizen to absolute liar entirely exposes the hypocrisy of the elite class. They didn't genuinely doubt the messenger's character.
They understood the math perfectly.
Right. They realized that if the messenger's equitable system was actually adopted, their massive concentration of wealth would be dismantled. So they made a calculated decision. They preferred the risk of eventual systemic collapse over the immediate loss of their power and wealth.
Which leads us to the most dangerous cognitive bias of empires.
I love this part.
If this unjust system is mathematically guaranteed to collapse, why do the elites feel so secure in their decision to maintain it? If you rig a system so fundamentally, shouldn't you be terrified of the impending crash every single day?
You'd think so, but I'm looking at verses 22.47 and 48. The powerful elites, having rejected the warning, actually start mocking the messenger.
They demand the punishment be hastened.
Yeah, they are essentially standing in their lofty palaces saying, "Look around, buddy. We are wealthier than ever, our military is unmatched, our technology is pristine. If your equitable system is right and our exploitative system is wrong, why aren't we destroyed today? Bring on the collapse."
It is the ultimate arrogance of the immediate present. They are demanding instant, visible cause and effect. But the text introduces a foundational sociological law here, the law of respite, or molat.
This concept of molat, it fundamentally alters how we have to view history.
The text states, "A day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of what you count." Now, this is not a mystical riddle about time travel or relativity. It is a clinical statement about the timescale of macro history versus the timescale of a human lifespan.
Social consequences do not unfold on a human timeline. An individual might live for, 80 years? A CEO might plan for a quarterly earnings report. A politician plans for a 4-year election cycle.
But a civilization breathes in centuries.
Exactly. The delay between the cause, the institutionalization of the injustice, and the effect of the final societal collapse is vast. It can take hundreds of years for the rot in the algorithm to finally bring down the physical infrastructure.
So the elites who write the exploitative laws, who rig the markets in Midian or build the vanity pillars in Ad, will very likely die rich, comfortable, and celebrated in their beds long before the bill comes due.
And that time lag is exactly what fools them into thinking the universal law of requital doesn't apply to them.
How many a township I gave respite while it was unjust, then I seized it. They confuse a long fuse with a dead bomb.
That's a great way to put it. They mistake the delay of the crash for permanent immunity.
The source lecture provides an incredibly visceral medical analogy for this delay, the concept of slow poisoning.
Let's lay this out carefully because it's so illustrative. Imagine a person who starts consuming small, sub-lethal doses of arsenic every single day.
The accumulative effect.
Right. They don't die instantly. In fact, Due to the way the human body reacts to low-level toxins, their cheeks might initially look flushed. Their skin might appear vibrant.
To a casual observer, they might look uncommonly healthy and energized.
I used to think the flushed cheeks were just a cosmetic side effect, but it's actually the cardiovascular system working overtime, desperately trying to manage the toxin.
It's an immune response.
Exactly.
Right.
The flush isn't health, it's a distress signal. And one day, that accumulation reaches a critical mass, the tipping point, and the organs violently and suddenly shut down.
If we map the arsenic analogy onto sociology, an unjust society operates the exact same way. It might look incredibly robust for decades, even centuries. It might be generating massive GDP, achieving technological marvels, fielding an invincible military. It possesses the flushed cheeks of prosperity.
They look at their soaring stock markets and say, "See? Our system is perfect. We are immune to the laws of history."
They mistake the flushed cheeks of a systemic fever for the glow of permanent health.
They're looking at the wrong metrics entirely. A rising stock market in a society where the middle class is collapsing into debt peonage is not a sign of health.
No, it is a sign that capital is successfully being extracted from the well and moved into the lofty palace.
The arsenic is accumulating.
The timeline is the trap. The human inability to perceive slow, accumulative, systemic risk over multi-generational spans is the exact definition of the blindness of the heart mentioned in the very first verse we discussed.
But if that's true, if the collapse is just a natural accumulative consequence of the system itself, if it's just the arsenic finally doing its job, then what is the actual role of the messenger?
That's the key question.
If he isn't calling down some supernatural punishment from the sky to destroy them, what is he actually doing?
We find the precise definition of his role in verse 22.49. Say, "O mankind, I am only a clear warner to you."
A warner, not an enforcer.
The source text frames the messenger purely as a diagnostic tool. Think of him like an independent auditor or a physician reading a blood test.
Okay.
The physician doesn't give you the disease. The physician reads the data, states the biological law, and points to the inevitable outcome if you refuse to change your diet.
So the messenger is basically standing in the city square saying, here is the universal law of historical rise and fall.
Yeah.
Here's the forensic evidence from the ruined cities of Ad and Thamud.
Your society is currently running the exact same exploitative algorithm that caused their collapse.
If you do not restructure your economy, the system itself will crash.
Exactly. No one is being arbitrarily punished by a wrathful deity. The consequence is delivered by the socio-economic system itself. Every township, every civilization writes its own verdict by how it treats the concept of justice. It is an automated mechanism.
I want to dig into a really sharp critique the source material brings up regarding the economics of this diagnostic role.
The issue of compensation.
Yeah. The messenger is explicitly noted across multiple texts as saying, I ask of you no reward. He doesn't charge a fee.
This is a profound systemic requirement. The lecture heavily criticizes the concept of professional clergy.
The business of selling religion.
Exactly. When religion becomes a profession, when clerics depend on the elites for their livelihood, for their salaries, or to fund their massive religious institutions, they entirely lose their diagnostic objectivity.
Because you can't bite the hand that funds your temple.
A professional cleric will never look at the ruling elite and tell them that their wealth is built on a toxic, systemic injustice that is dooming the entire society.
They'd lose their funding overnight.
Instead, they will offer a transactional spiritual bypass. They will tell a wealthy elite, just build a new place of worship, give a small percentage to charity, say these specific prayers, and your wealth is purified. You are safe.
They offer a localized individual pardon while completely ignoring the systemic rot.
But the true messenger, because he asks for no fee and is entirely economically independent of the elite class, cannot be bought.
Right.
He can look the elite in the eye and say, your charity is mathematically irrelevant if the system generating your wealth is fundamentally exploitative. You cannot poison the public well all year and make up for it by handing out bottled water on the holidays.
I love that. It is the difference between a consultant who is paid to tell management what they want to hear and an independent auditor who is simply stating the facts of the ledger.
Perfectly said.
And that auditor lays out two, and only two, possible outcomes for the society. Let's examine the constructive pass first, found in verse 22.50. What happens when a society actually listens to the audit?
When they cure the blindness of their intellect.
Right, when they study the ruins and adopt a truly equitable socio-economic system. The verse guarantees two outcomes. Mughfirat, and Rizq-e-Kareem.
These are two more terms that have been completely diluted by traditional translation. We need to define them systemically.
Let's do it. Traditional translations almost universally render Mughfirat as forgiveness, usually in a purely spiritual post-mortem sense. You made a mistake, God forgives you, you go to heaven.
But Parwez utterly rejects that localized emotional translation. He looks at the linguistic root. Mughfirat means protection or covering. It is literally a helmet worn in battle.
The helmet.
Yes. Systemically, it means building a society that is comprehensively protected. Protected from the fear of starvation, protected from external military threats, protected from internal collapse, and protected from legal injustice.
It's not about sitting in a fragile house feeling emotionally forgiven while a hurricane tears the roof off.
No.
Mughfirat is the act of reinforcing the walls, upgrading the electrical grid, and ensuring the structural integrity of the house so that when the storm hits, you are genuinely safe.
It is the state of systemic security that arises organically when a society is built on equity. When you don't have a starving underclass, you don't need to fear an internal revolution.
And that physical and societal security leads directly to the second promise, Rizq-e-Kareem, which is, again, traditionally translated as just generous provision.
Which makes it sound like a really nice banquet.
Yeah, cosmic buffet.
But sociologically, Rizq-e means the means of sustenance, the resources required for development and growth. And Kareem means honorable, noble, or dignified.
So Rizq-e-Kareem is an honorable socio-economic system.
It means the resources, the education, the healthcare, the access to capital, the water from the well are distributed equitably to every single individual in the society.
Wow.
It ensures that every human being has the material means to develop their full potential with absolute dignity. It is not just about keeping people barely alive with basic survival rations.
It's not just welfare.
No, it is the systemic guarantee of a dignified life for all citizens, completely eliminating the need for the degrading dynamics of extreme wealth and extreme poverty.
So a society that actually cures its intellectual blindness and structures its economy for equity achieves ironclad systemic protection, Mughfirat, and dignified human development Rizq-e-Kareem.
It's a remarkably rational, almost mathematical blueprint for civilization.
It really is. But what about the alternative? What happens to the societies that double down on their exploitation? The elites who, as verse 22.51 puts it, strive to frustrate our signs.
The verse states their outcome is Jahim.
Right, which is traditionally translated as hellfire, conjuring images of literal fire and brimstone and pitchforks.
But once again, if we strip away the mythical imagery and look at the linguistic root, Jahim means to stare with wide, unblinking eyes.
Like a deer in headlights.
Exactly. It means a state of absolute stagnation. It is paralysis.
A civilizational dead end.
When a society insists on maintaining an unjust system, it eventually has to expend all of its energy, all of its capital, and all of its innovation just trying to maintain the unnatural imbalances it has created.
They just bleed out trying to keep the status quo alive.
Right. The elites have to build higher walls, militarize their police forces, and create increasingly complex financial instruments just to protect their lofty palaces from the starving masses at the abandoned well.
The system completely stops creating and only defends.
Innovation dies. Social trust dies. The velocity of money hits zero. The society becomes entirely static, rigid, and ultimately it seizes up. It enters Jahim.
Wow.
It is the sociological equivalent of thermodynamic heat death. It becomes utterly irrelevant to the forward march of human history, leaving nothing behind but another set of ruins for future generations to dig up.
The engine seizes because they refuse to change the oil. He just sat there revving it until the block melted down.
Yes.
It isn't a supernatural punishment. It is just the logical, physical end state of a poorly designed system.
The consequences delivered by the system itself.
This has been a massive paradigm shift. I mean, we started by looking at a text that is almost universally read in a purely theological, ritualistic context, and we've decoded it as a high-level manual for civilizational engineering.
And the entire passage demands strict adherence to a scientific method.
It really does. Travel, observe the physical world, gather data from the rumens.
Compare the variables across different historical cultures. Isolate the root cause of collapse, which is systemic injustice, or zulm, and then use your intellect to reason your way to a sustainable socio-economic model.
History is the laboratory. The data is all right there, peer-reviewed by time itself.
The civilizational lesson is undeniable. A people that refuses to study why others fell, a people that treats its own ruins, or the ruins of past empires, as mere tourist scenery rather than hard forensic evidence.
They are the picnickers.
Right. That society is the very definition of having working eyes but a blind heart. Their intellect is paralyzed.
And the remedy for a society running headlong toward collapse is not blind faith. It is not more intense rituals or religious sentimentality.
The remedy is the ruthless, unflinching application of reason to the historical record, until the laws of civilizational rise and fall become so obvious and so undeniable that society is forced to change its course.
Which brings us back to where we started. The flashing dashboard. The unseen crack in the concrete pillar. We assume we are fundamentally different from the people of Noah, from Ad, from Thamud, or Midian.
We assume our digital technology, our globalized financial instruments, and our sheer modern arrogance make us immune to these ancient laws.
But the law of Molat, the law of the long time scale, is always operating in the background. The arsenic is always accumulating.
It never stops.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over as you step back into your day. Look around. Take a good, hard look at the lofty palaces of our own modern world, the unprecedented concentration of corporate wealth, the billionaires racing to build private space stations,
And then look at the economic wells of the working class.
the hollowed-out middle class, the rising costs of basic dignified survival. Are we truly as robust, as advanced, and as permanent as we think we are? Or are we just experiencing the flushed cheeks of slow poisoning?
A brief technological respite.
Exactly. Are we mistaking a brief technological respite for a permanent civilizational acquittal? Keep your eyes open, sure, but more importantly, make sure your heart, your intellect is reasoning.